WSDQ Dunlap, WEPG South Pittsburgh, The Copperhead, WSDT Soddy Daisy, Chattanooga.
The viewpoints expressed on LibertyWorks Radio Network are not necessarily those of the network, its affiliates, or sponsors. This is LibertyWorks Radio Network. Now live from coast to coast and around the globe. More real talk, the kind you want, on LibertyWorks Radio Network.
And good afternoon to all of you LibertyWorks Radio listeners out there. It happens to be Friday evening. It also happens to be 5 Central Time, 6 Eastern, 3 Pacific Time, and every day of the week during this time slot, the Truth Attack Hour appears on this network. And on Fridays, you've got me. My name's Larry Becraft. I'm from Huntsville, Alabama, and I invite you to listen to the remainder of the program. Gary Thomason and I have these shows, and the purpose is to educate our listeners about important legal issues. You know, one of the things I have learned during the course of my life is that a lot of American people really need to know legal principles, but they really don't have access to any way of learning some really important legal principles. And so that's one of the reasons why we devote the time, we give the big effort to this show. And the reason is to educate our fellow Americans about important legal issues. Now, over the last couple of weeks, you know, there's a lot of people that are really interested in constitutional issues, statutory issues that relate to federal taxation. And that's something that Gary and I are talking about quite often. And today we're going to be talking about that. Before Gary gets off into a discussion of the Civil War Income Tax Acts, I want to bring him home. But then, before he gets around to that topic, I've got a related topic I want to explain to our listeners, because it's a legal principle that if you're educated about this legal principle, then you can see it in too many circumstances that the average American encounters as he goes through life. Now let me bring on Gary Thomason from Mesa, Arizona. Gary, you with us?
Good afternoon, Larry. Yes, sir, I am with you, and send a great hello to all the LibertyWorks listeners, and a great invitation to stick around. We're going to talk about some issues dealing with the Civil War income tax, which was the first income tax, basically, and it has some interesting connections to the current.
Well, good.
So,
now, Gary, I told our listeners I'm going to make a sidetrack here. I'm going to go off on something completely different. But, this is an issue for 15, 20 years I've been interested in. But of late, the more, what got me off on this current tack is I'm interfacing with and working with some people up in New York. They're trying to fight you got to have vaccines to put your kids in schools issue. And to me, this issue is real important. And, that issue about vaccines is real important. But this issue that deals with equal protection is something that could be applied in this situation. But then this equal protection argument applies in so many other circumstances. Now, let me give you some circumstances in which this applies. Years ago, I raised this issue in some cases here in Alabama and in Texas that dealt with the requirement to get a Social Security number in order to get a driver's license. Now, you will be able to see, once I explain this concept to you, why that issue, this equal protection argument, could apply in that situation. But then let's come forward into time. Let's deal with something a little bit more recent. And then we'll deal with something very recent. Now, what's more recent than the Social Security number issue and driver's licenses is a situation involving national health care, Obamacare. They came along in Obamacare, and they take this limited situation, a problem created by people who are uninsured, and then they use that problem created by Americans who are uninsured, the burden that they impose on the medical community, the medical industry. They're burdening the medical industry. It's a real problem. And so Congress comes along, and with this excuse of a problem, a limited problem like that, they want to use that as an excuse to take over the entire medical delivery industry. And this principle applies there. But then also, listen to this. It also applies in this issue involving, efforts to, strengthen, to enact new gun laws. Now, what's the reason why they're wanting to enact these new gun laws? Well, we had situations like, that queer establishment down in Florida, some muzzy shot him up a couple of years ago. That was a big tragedy. And then we had here recently in El Paso, Texas. This situation, some kid walks into a Walmart and shot up a whole bunch of people. And then about the same time, we had a situation, I think it was in Columbus, Ohio. We have periodically, and I kind of think there's a lot more to the picture than these are just random events by just some unhinged people. There may be a drug connection here, these people are on psychotic drugs and it causes them to do that. But then again, it may be something more than that. I don't want to get into conspiracies, but that is a real problem. Now, how do involving this situation involving Social Security numbers and driver's licenses, Obamacare, taking a problem caused by a minority and using that as an excuse to take over the entire medical industry. And then also, here we have these, tragic events involving, gun shootings. And that then becomes the excuse, as Pat Shannon emails me some emails every now and then that, have, down at the bottom, 81 million gun owners cause no problems today. Oh, that's right. And that's the reason why we got this equal protection argument. Now, let's talk about this equal protection argument, and then I'm going to apply it to certain specific facts involving like the Social Security number, the driver's licenses, Obamacare, and this effort to bring in heavier restraints on the exercise of the Second Amendment, new gun laws. Here's the principle: the 14th Amendment imposes upon states a constitutional requirement that no citizen shall be deprived of the equal protection of the laws. What in the world is equal protection? Now, before I get into an explanation of what those principles are, I want to tell our listeners that this principle involving equal protection, it certainly applies by plain language to the states by means of the 14th Amendment. But the Supreme Court has also said, hey, the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment, which applies to the federal government, it incorporates these principles of equal protection, and thus, since the Due Process Clause is applicable to the federal government, then the Equal Protection Clause equally applies to the federal government. So, both governments, state governments and federal governments, they're subject to these principles involving equal protection. Now, let's get around to an explanation of these principles. Let's say that a legislature is confronting a problem of drunk drivers. And let's say that 10% of the driving public is involved with this problem involving drunk drivers. Now, that's probably a large number, but, it's suitable for example purposes. So in this situation, the legislature comes along, and to address the problem involving drunk drivers, they impose a requirement that applies to not only drunk drivers, but also the sober drivers, people that are not a part of the problem. That's one equal protection problem. A legislative body, when it's going to address a problem, they've got to focus in on the problem and apply the legislation to that problem. But if they apply the legislation to, situations that are broader than the problem, then that brings in equal protection problems. These are problems involving classifications. So in this situation, if a state law applicable to address this problem involving drunk drivers is made to be broader to apply to all of the driving public in the state, then the problem that you have is one of classification. And the classification here of people that are subject to the law is overly broad. It's over-inclusive. And so your equal protection argument arises because the statute is broader than the problem. However, you can also have a situation in which the solution to this drunk driving problem is addressed by the legislature in a more limited way. Let's say that the legislature comes along and to resolve the problem involving drunk drivers, they make this new law to solve that problem applicable only to drunk drivers that are red-headed. Well, if you got the problem caused by drunk drivers includes all drunk drivers, and red-headed drivers are a subset of that. So if the legislative solution in that situation is to make the law only applicable to solve the problem of drunk drivers and make it applicable only to red-headed drunk drivers, then that's a problem involving equal protection, but that's called an under-inclusive classification. So now, let's quickly take these principles, over-inclusive and under-inclusive classifications, which are used in equal protection analysis. In this situation involving driver's licenses, the requirement to have Social Security numbers for driver's licenses came about because of deadbeat dads. But those who have driver's licenses, some deadbeat dads have driver's licenses, but most people who have driver's licenses aren't deadbeat dads. So coming along and imposing to solve the deadbeat dad problem, imposing a burden on all of the driving public instead of just deadbeat dads, that's an overbroad classification for equal protection analysis. Now let's take a look at Obamacare. Let's say that 10% of the American public is causing the problem involving the medical system we have here in this country, the delivery of medical services. Well, 10% of the populace causing the problem, those are the parties that should be involved in a solution of the problem. But to use a problem created by a minority and use that as an excuse to take over the entire medical delivery system, then what you have is an over-inclusive classification. The people that are not causing the problem with, the problems confronted with American health care, since they're not the problem, cutting off, saying things like, they need to have their insurance taken away from them. They're forced into a universal health care program. That there is an over-inclusive response, and it violates equal protection to come along and burden their constitutional rights. Now, the same thing applies to guns. As some of these emails say, hey, 81 million Americans cause no problem involving guns today, and only a small segment of American society did something with guns today that needs to be regulated. Using that limited situation as an excuse to come along and deny Americans their Second Amendment constitutional rights, doing that is an over-inclusive classification. So we're about to the end of the first segment. I wanted to take these first few minutes in the opening segment of this program to explain this incredibly important constitutional problem that every American can see. We've all been exposed to this in the last 10 to 15 years. We hear it. But it's because you don't know about these constitutional principles that, you don't grasp the significance of a solution to them. Now, Gary has the music coming on.
It sounds like a launch pad, doesn't it, Larry?
Yeah, it does. Well, folks, we'll be coming up on our break here in a minute. I have 5:14. I don't hear the music in the background, but when Gary comes, when we come back from this short break, Gary is going to continue what we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks. Explaining the legislative history behind some of these income tax laws and understanding what happened during the Civil War. History is real important, even legal history. And that's what we're going to talk about. See you in a few minutes. And welcome back to this afternoon's show, the Truth Attack Hour. This is segment 2. Now, during segment 1, I talked about these principles of equal protection that are real important. People need to know about it. If you have a little bit of an understanding about some of these legal principles, then when you encounter them in ordinary everyday life, now you see a solution. And life can be a little bit more exciting because you know a way that you can solve a problem created by forces that you are opposed to. So I hope you understand that this equal protection principle, once you have a good grasp of it, and I've got over on my website, if you go to my website, Dixieland Law Journal, don't use an internet search engine like Google, use Start Page or something else, type in Dixieland Law Journal or Becraft Briefs. That'll go to this website where I post legal materials. And once you get over to the Dixieland Law Journal, there's a file on the front page linked to another page, Constitutional Materials. Click on that, and that'll carry you over to a page where you can find a link to a page that I've got devoted to cites to, summaries of, and links to important equal protection cases that you can read. So now, Gary, now that I have done what I want to do today in the way of educating our listeners, you have a different purpose. You want to get back to what we have been talking about for 5 and 6 weeks. Well, as we typically do during the course of this program, of educating people about statutes and constitutions and stuff like that. Today, you want to inform our listeners about a little-known aspect. When somebody sits down and takes a look at the tax laws, there's an area nobody really cares to get into. And that's what happened during the Civil War. So you're going to explain that to us. Take off.
I am indeed. Thank you, Larry. Well, the Civil War income tax was really about the first income tax that was laid upon the American people. In fact, there's a case I'd like to mention to you that kind of explains it. You have the Supreme Court explaining it through a case that was handled during the Civil War and shortly thereafter. So, well, let's just start with the case is called Railroad Company versus Jackson. And if you have trouble finding it or whatever, send me an email at Gary@npn.net, GARY@npn.net, and we'll get engaged in a dialogue, or I'll send you the case, and you can refer to it freely. But nonetheless, this is where the Supreme Court said the very first tax of this kind was imposed by an act of Congress passed on August 5th of 1861. The 49th section of that act directed that there should be levied and collected upon the annual income of every person residing in the United States from whatever source derived, and a tax of 3% on the amount of the excess of such income over $800 and upon the income of rents, dividends accruing upon property owned in the United States by any citizen residing outside the United States, residing abroad. So that's a mouthful right there. But just if I could just paraphrase it and break it down, and they're talking about every person residing in the United States, and they're talking about person being a foreign person, and I think that's a fair way to characterize a person would be a foreign person, because on the other hand, they're talking about a citizen with income residing abroad. So,
okay, can I stop you right here and ask a question? So the 1861, that's the first income tax act adopted by the federal government?
That is, August 5th, 1861.
And the two subjects of that law were persons residing in the United States and citizens residing abroad.
Pretty clear, huh?
Okay. Wow.
Now, as I understand it, that act really didn't get kicked in until 1862, but it still basically covered the same people and the same circumstances.
That's what I have learned during the course of my studies involving the income tax. Gary, they knew that they were going to have big expenditures during the war, and that they knew that they were going to use, paper money to finance the Civil War. And so whenever you're going to be doing something like that, you need a mechanism to suck out that excess paper money from the economy. So every time you have a war, they learned from England. They needed an income tax. And so they're getting ready to flood the economy with a whole bunch of paper. And they knew that was going to happen because of the Civil War.
That is exactly what happened, isn't it?
Yep.
Greenbacks, right?
Yep.
Good old-fashioned greenback. Anyway, the next act was the 1862 Act, and that section, the naughtiest section of that tax act, directed that there should be levied and collected a tax of 3% on the annual income of every person residing in the United States over $600 and under $10,000, and when exceeding $10,000, a tax of 5%. So, but just keeping in mind the loose wording referring to the amounts, let's just keep in mind every person residing in the United States. And upon the income of citizens residing abroad, tax 5%. So they were consistent between the 1861 to the 1862 Act, talking about persons, foreigners, residing in the United States, and citizens of the United States residing abroad. Now, this is the foundation of our income tax, as I understand it. This is the first income tax that they actually enacted. So, but this case, this Railroad versus Jackson case, involved the next year, which was 1864. And without getting into the nitty-gritty details of that case, what it was is Mr. Jackson had bought some gold bonds from a railroad in Pennsylvania, I believe it was, and Pennsylvania was trying to impose a tax on him on the railroad bonds when he cashed them in. Same with the collector of internal revenue. But just for the sake of understanding the progression, we have the 1861 Act that really didn't, I don't believe it actually went into effect, because when they came out with the 1862 Act, that was classified as the first income tax. 1864, it was passed June 30th, 1864, and that act directed the levy and collection of a tax of 5% upon the excess of income of every person residing in the United States or of any citizens residing abroad. So the 1861, 1862, and the 1864 Act covered the same people. They changed the amounts up a little bit, and we won't burden ourselves with going through the numbers, but just for the effect of it, the 1861, 1862, and 1864 Act were very consistent. Persons residing in the United States, citizens residing abroad. Now, if Congress refers to a person residing within the United States and citizens residing abroad, would that indicate, Larry, that there might be a difference between the meaning behind a person and a citizen?
Yeah, that's... Hey, Gary, I've often wanted to, there are people out there that have got these ideas, and, I use ideas that I get from laws. And one idea that I got from laws relates to, when the states were being created by the federal government, they were territories first, and then they were created states. Congress would come along and say, well, this new state, its legislative power shall extend to lawful subjects of legislation. And, I've often wanted to, this movement, the freedom movement, to adopt that language that appears in these old acts of Congress, lawful subjects of legislation. It's real important because a lot of people are wondering about it. They make arguments. I'm not a lawful subject of legislation of this particular law. That's what we're arguing about. And here what you're talking about is, well, who are these lawful subjects of legislation? You described a person residing in the United States and a citizen residing abroad. Hey, we need a better definition of who those are. Maybe we can figure it out. Is that the point you want to make? We can figure it out. Okay.
Well, and it seems pretty clear that a person would be a foreigner, but we probably want to have to do some inspecting and maybe a little research to verify that.
Yeah.
But it's pretty obvious that a citizen residing abroad, they're talking about, a citizen of the United States residing outside the United States.
Yeah. Well, it says so. Citizen residing abroad.
There you go.
That's not a citizen residing at home.
Right. But the resident, is obviously classified as a foreign person because a citizen is not classified as a resident. A citizen is classified as a citizen. And we could get deeper into the subject matter on it, but it seems to be very clear an alien resident residing in the United States and a citizen residing abroad were the two main characters of this income tax. And you notice that the citizen is outside the United States, whereas the foreign person is inside the United States. Persons residing in, citizens residing abroad. So there's opposite, but they're both taxed.
How long was the Civil War Income Tax Act in effect?
Well, there was one in 1861. That one actually didn't go into effect. The 1862 Act went into effect and lasted until 1864. The 1864 Act was very much the same as the 1862 Act, if I recall correctly. And then there was another act in 1866, which changed dramatically. And if you read that case, Railroad Company versus Jackson, very carefully, it seems to me, Larry, that the 1866 Act sounded a whole lot like the 16th Amendment, which didn't come around until 1913. But the 1866 Act was fairly well written. And the Supreme Court of the United States in Railroad Company versus Jackson actually made a comment about how it might not be within the purview of Congress to actually do this, but they're not going to reach that decision because this was not an issue in this particular case, the Railroad Company versus Jackson. But carrying on, well, we have the 1861 Act covered, 1862, 1864, got the 1866 tax. Now, this Railroad Company versus Jackson, just to kind of feed a little background, this Mr. Jackson had a very large investment in gold bonds of a railroad, and he decided to cash those bonds in the year 1865, which means that the 1864 Act would have been in effect at that time. And so if you're following along with that premise, by the time that the case was settled in 1868, there was some discussion about the 1860s.
Gary, we got music coming on. Let us know we got a break. Hey, folks, Jerry's going to continue on. We'll be back in a few seconds. Stay tuned. And welcome back to our final segment of this afternoon's edition of the Truth Attack Hour. We covered quite a lot of ground in the course of this program. We talked about during the first segment the equal protection principles. Last segment, Gary was talking about the Civil War Income Tax Act, and we're going to continue that discussion. Now, but, I want to inform our listeners, when you study the income tax laws, the history of it, at least in the English-speaking worlds, when they created the Bank of England in 1695, William Patterson and his cohorts, they soon found out, boy, you can print up a whole bunch of money and you're going to have inflation. And so the response to the inflation in England created by the Bank of England, they came up with a solution, an income tax. Well, they came along and did the same thing with the Civil War. Here you're going to be involved in a war that's going to look like it's going to cover, a great length of time, involve a lot of expenditures on the part of the federal government. So, hey, knowing that they're going to be printing a bunch of paper money, Congress comes along and says, we're going to need an income tax. So the federal government during the course of the Civil War got all of its resources by issuing pieces of paper. Comparable wealth wasn't surrendered by the federal government to get, cannons and ships and ammo and cannonballs and stuff like that. Foods, supplies. Uncle Sam got it all for pieces of paper. And to prevent inflation, as there are documents on my website explain the purpose of taxation is when you have a government that exists independent of taxation because it's issuing pieces of paper, that government needs to use taxation to suck up that excess credit. So now, Gary, I've taken a little bit too much time explaining the reason why the Civil War income tax acts were adopted. I think you need to pick up and continue explaining to our listeners this period of time that nobody really talks about.
It's a very interesting time, indeed. And, and the basis of our income tax, got its roots firmly planted in 1861, 1862. And by 1864, they were starting to, become a little more creative with it. But 1866 comes along and, they threw a wrench into cogs. They were, and if you read, and I won't read it, but I think it's a fair challenge to say, hey, email me at gary@npn.net. I'll send you the Railroad Company versus Jackson case. I'd like for you to read the 1866 Act and see just exactly what Congress was doing. And I'll just throw a little hint out there. It sounds a whole lot like the 16th Amendment. So it's pretty interesting. And the way that the Supreme Court dealt with that question will probably make you smile. So, feel free to send me an email at gary@npn.net. I'll send you a copy of the case. You read it, and when you get down to the part about the Supreme Court having to deal with the 1866 Act, probably crack a smile because it sounds a whole lot like the 16th Amendment to me. But anyway, let's get back to this case. Mr. Jackson was an alien. He was a citizen of Ireland, and he was buying some railroad bonds in the United States of America, the Northern Central Railroad Company, and it was incorporated in the state of Maryland. And what he was trying to do is he was trying to recover his investment in this in this railroad, and they taxed him. So anyway, they demanded the payment. They went through all the steps to challenge it, and this case resolves that question. And this is some fun facts about how simple things can be ironed out if we listen to all the details. For example, this case took place in 1868. Mr. Jackson sold those bonds in 1865. An 1864 Act applied during that time. They changed up the laws in 1866. The state of Maryland was trying to tax him on the 1866 Act, And the Supreme Court says, hey, hold on a second, not so quick. The Tax Act involved in this case is 1864. He sold the bonds, and lo and behold, we're talking, ladies and gentlemen, about 1865, $2.5 million in gold bonds.
Wow,
this
he
guy
had money. He was rolling in money.
He was rolling. And the state was trying to rip it, and the federal government was trying to rip it out of his hands, and the Supreme Court said he is entitled to that money. So he had equal protection under the law. He received the payments and lived happily ever after, as far as I could tell.
Well, so what's the lesson you get out of that case?
Well, the lesson is that the Supreme Court has given us kind of a string of different tax acts, and they're making it very clear that a person residing in the United States is a foreigner residing in the United States, and a citizen residing abroad is different than a person residing within the United States. So there's some key takeaway points. And so, for example, today's tax, say for Section 1441, is the tax imposed on the income of a non-resident alien individual. Citizen is over in Section 911. I know it sounds conspiratorial, but that's the section 911. So when we look at the Income Tax Act, we have to know exactly what year we're talking about, with the citizenship, nationality of the payee, determination of that payee status, and all these other details. There's no secret behind it. We're required to know all this material, and and I personally invite everybody to engage in a conversation. I am more than welcome. I welcome your emails, any discussion or any question you may have, and if I don't know the answer, I'll always hey,
I know what you'll do. If you don't know it, you're going to go looking for the answer.
I will. I promise you that. And if I can't find it, I know who could. And that would be Larry Becraft right there.
Well, so, Gary, you're saying that the scheme, when you sit down and take a look at who's expressly discussed as being the subject of the Civil War Income Tax Act, you see this pattern there: persons residing in the United States, citizens residing abroad, and there's a lot of significance to that fact, right?
Absolutely.
And
we have to.
That case you were talking about, Mr. Jackson from Ireland, $2.5 million in Ireland, He was a non-resident alien.
Sure was.
And so since he was the subject of the effort to collect the tax from him, they must have considered him to be a person deriving income from sources within the United States.
That's correct. Except, the law back then said he had to be residing within the United States, and he was not residing within the United States. He was residing in his home country of Ireland.
And so he won, and Uncle Sam, because the law only applied to persons residing in the United States, only persons residing in the United States had the tax imposed. And since he wasn't residing in the United States, he wasn't subject to the tax.
That's correct.
Well, did they ever expand the Civil War income tax to include persons not in the United States but engaged in trade or business here?
Well, that's very interesting point, because the last paragraph of the Railroad Company versus Jackson case is the Supreme Court says, it is not important, however, to pursue that argument, as Congress has since, in express terms, by the acts of March 10th and July 13th, 1866, imposed a tax on alien non-resident bondholders. So the question hereafter will not be whether the law embraced the alien non-resident holder, but whether it is competent for Congress to impose it, upon which we express no opinion. So the Supreme Court was very mindful of that point, because, you had the federal government as well as the state government trying to get their sticky fingers on this guy's gold. So, but the Supreme Court said,
wow,
in 1866 of all time periods of time, that's a lot of money, if you live in Baltimore,
Yeah. Well, very good, Gary. So what's the lesson that our listeners take away from today?
Well, the lesson, I think, is that here you have a case. They lay out the facts in the case. We need to know what our facts are. We also need to know what the law says, and we need to be able to apply it to the facts and then apply it to the law of the case. If we kind of start working in that direction, being deliberate, finding out exactly, because the current laws are not really that complex. We have to find out whether you're a citizen of the United States, or you're a resident of the United States, or you're a non-resident alien. Those are the three characters that participate in the federal income tax today. Right, Larry?
Yeah. Real important. Hey, and I want to tell our listeners, you can download. It's real important for people to download the old tax acts and the old regulations. And today, since they're word searchable, what Gary's talking about, you can see just by pulling up a tax act, looking through it, and engaging in word searches. And that's the reason why all of the old tax acts from 1913 forward are posted over my website for that express purpose.
And let me add, y'all, I am not a lawyer. I am a student that studies regularly what the law says, and I try to comprehend it and apply it to exactly what the facts would be in a specific case. So you don't have to be a lawyer, and we're not telling you to run down the road with your hair on fire. But when you're just reading some of this material, like this case, you can become very interested not only in the law of the case, but you'll become interested in the history behind it. And, you learn a little bit about Mr. Jackson and his $2.5 million in bonds, how the Supreme Court addressed the issues of income tax. They explain the sections and who the sections applied to and how. And, and it's like, to me, and Larry, correct me if I'm mistaken, but it seems like to me that this 1864 Act is a little more complicated than the tax laws today. Yeah.
But hey, Gary, we're going to have to pass on saying anything more because the music in the background letting us know the end of the show's arrived. As usual, it's been great to have you on the program.
It's always a pleasure to be with you.
And folks, y'all be sure to come back next week and listen to another edition of this program. And watch LSU and Auburn tomorrow. Are you going to do that, Gary?
Yeah. I'm afraid so.
Okay. See you.
Join the cavalcade to freedom. The cavalcade back to constitutional